Hi, Frank. How are you today?
Very well. Thank you for having me, Marcellus.
Hey, no problem. Actually, it's a pleasure for me, and I think it'll be really insightful for the people who get to share in this. So, just for people who don't know you, just tell me a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Zimbabwean, and I'm someone who's very passionate about leadership. Growing up, all I ever wanted to be was to be a chartered accountant. But one funny incident led me into speech coaching for CFOs. And before I knew it, I was involved in helping a lot of CFOs or chief financial officers prepare for their high stakes presentations. And so for
Hmm.
about 18 months, I actually thought that these people genuinely cared about speeches until I figured out that actually they didn't really care about speeches. What they really cared about was managing their reputation. And it was in the process of actually learning to grasp at that and understand some of their emotional needs that I started figuring out how I could be more useful to the same audience in many different ways. And so at some point, which is how I also know one of our colleagues, Barry, I was involved in strategy, and I discovered that some of the best strategies that I was able to facilitate were ideas that never came from me. They're ideas that came in internally. However, sometimes when you've got technical people, they're extremely brilliant at what they do, but they struggle with a breathing creature called a human. And that's when I really, so that's when I got passionate about helping them understand each other internally so that they could collaborate on some of the brilliant ideas that they have. And so this tied naturally with my living conditions as a Zimbabwean, which is why I mentioned this earlier. Zimbabwe is a very beautiful country that I believe has been ravaged by poor leadership. And so growing up, I used to have friends, for example, who didn't have parents around. And it wasn't out of personal choice, but these people had to go out for economic
Hmm.
benefit to be able to sustain the lives that they were having. And so I've always had this dream of having people live fully from anywhere. And so part of that has led to a goal that pretty much encapsulates the question, who is Frank? And I think I've dedicated my
Hmm.
life to creating 100,000 honest leaders, leaders with vision, leaders who are authentic in
Wow.
people's interests and their challenges, and leaders with the courage to do what needs to be done to avert those challenges. And I think that's what pretty much defines me in many words.
There's a lot to unpack there. So, I'm going to try and take it bit by bit because one of the things kind of moving backwards in the conversation is you talk about inspiring 100. You have a specific numbered goal, which is a key thing and most people will know about goal setting is it being smart, but being very specific and measurable. So it looks like you have that. But then jumping to the beginning of what you said, what I liked was the fact that you were talking about the fact that these leaders, what they really care about was about their reputation. And so what are some of the techniques that actually, what was the journey for you to actually discover that? What were some of the things that you feel you are aware of that you can help people to be aware of in themselves to recognize what it is they really care about and come to that conclusion if it is their reputation.
Okay, so I think the journey was a bit different when I started because when I got into business, I didn't go into business by design, it was by accident.
Hmm.
I had a friend of mine who knew that I was a member of an organization called Toastmasters. And so
Yes.
for those who don't know Toastmasters, it's where people go to learn how to be able to speak in front of an audience confidently. And so because of that, he was doing his MBA program and needed someone to help him with his MBA dissertation presentation. And so he asked me if I could help him, and I said, sure, why not? So I helped him. And then a couple of days later, he came back to me and he says, Frank, my colleagues saw my presentation and they loved it. And they need your help too. But because they're not your friends, you've got to charge them.
Yes.
And so this is pretty
Hmm.
much how I got into business. I didn't have much of
Hmm.
a framework or a structure. Now, the reason why I had initially joined Toastmasters to contrast this was I wanted to be a world champion of public speaking. And so there was an element of contest speaking in my mind, which are some of the
Mm-hmm.
same principles now that I was now trying to dump on these executives whenever they spoke. However, unlike me, they weren't interested in contests. Some of them just wanted to survive the stage. And so I went through
Mm-hmm.
a period of resistance as I worked with my clients. Where I was trying to teach them all those things that would make them great speakers, and that they just wanted the opposite. And I think a bit of conversation over a period of about 18 months, that is when I got to understand. However, nowadays, a very big part of the work that I do is I often like to draw people's attention to what's important to them. And so, what's important to you is what we call your values. And the thing about
Mm-hmm.
values is values are dynamic, right? They change depending on which stage you are in your life. And I'll give a rough
Mm-hmm.
example. So when you were a child, you had your parents or your guardians pretty much telling you what to do when you're at home, and your teachers
Mm-hmm.
telling you what to do when you're at school.
So,
And so maybe you dreamt of the day when you could decide what time you would do the dishes and not have to
mm-hmm.
do the dishes whenever your mom or your
Mm-hmm.
guardian asked you to do them. And then there came a time, if you were lucky enough, where you moved out of home. And so where you wanted that freedom to choose the time to do the dishes, now you had the freedom. However, maybe as a young 20-something-year-old, you had the freedom, but you didn't quite have the money. And so that money became very important to you in that stage to pursue. And then at some point, maybe you pursued that money and you got the money and you discovered, you know what, I've got the money, but maybe you no longer have the time because work is
Yep.
taking up your time. Maybe you've started a family. And so time becomes important to you. And God forbid, do we get to a point where you finally retired, you've got the time and money, but you no longer have the health. The point I'm trying to make is values change as your life changes, as you accomplish goals. There's a saying sometimes that the majority of values that people have are that as individuals we value what we don't have. And so, yes, there are some underlying core values that have served us through life, but a number of your values can easily be traced to, oh, maybe I do not have freedom right now because, for example, I'm living in South Africa most of my time. Yet it's not necessarily always by choice, but there's an economic aspect tied to a bit of the socio-political environment in my country. And so I yearn for that freedom because maybe I don't have it. So freedom becomes a high value in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I take people through the process of discovering what's important to them, and I usually try and avoid value, they're using the word values because they start to come up with those corporate serious words like integrity, respect, service,
Mm-hmm.
or excellence. I start to, when they tell me what's important to them, it's at that point that I help them highlight things that seem to be popping up that are maybe not quite aligned to what they're already doing. So that's pretty much what I do
Mm-hmm.
most of my time.
Well, it's interesting because you brought something up there about people, their values may be driven on what they don't have. And recently I was listening to a podcast by Myron Golden, and he was talking about the habits that actually keep us from succeeding. And one
Yeah.
of them is ingratitude. And
Yeah.
ingratitude is another form of that, focusing on the things that you don't have rather than being thankful for the things that you do. In fact, one
Yes.
of the examples used in that is Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
They had everything, absolutely everything.
Absolutely.
And their fall was based upon them focusing on the one thing they didn't have, which was that knowledge of good and evil. So even that as a kind of showing the biblical story of how our focus on the things that we don't have can sometimes lead us down the wrong path. So it's a matter of, like you said, having, like for instance, you and I, we're part of the Oxford Review.
Hmm.
Having that community of people where, first of all, not only do we get to focus on what we do have, because that community for me, people remind me, oh my gosh, Marcellus, that was really interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
then I start to value what I already have. But it makes me curious about what I don't. Now,
Yeah.
to me, approaching it from a point of curiosity, I would like to learn more. When it's done with humility, it's like, I know what I have, I know what I don't, and you have that, tell me more.
Yeah.
It changes the shape of the conversations. So even for the fact that
Yes.
we're doing this right now on this podcast, is because we had, 25 minutes of a conversation, and I was intrigued by what you do, how you do it, and how you apply your knowledge, your skills, and experience to help the people that you work with. So one of the things that I picked up in the discussion with you in the Oxford Review, the serendipity session, was that your grandfather had a few children, right?
Yeah.
How many was that?
There's 22. At least the 22
20,
is what we know.
22 that you know of.
Yes.
Wow. And as you were talking through that, what occurred to me that there are so many things going on with that. So I would imagine it's a cultural thing. Like, I don't know if people really questioned, for one of the 20 children, if Papa or Dad said this, did they question it? How did he influence? Was it all hierarchical or whatever? Because it was kind of, to me, similar, like you have a family or a team or a unit or community in a business with just 5 or 6. That leaders have challenges engaging and motivating the five
Yes.
or six, let alone 22. So, what is your understanding of the way the dynamic was?
Yeah, obviously I didn't grow up into the family, but a recent experience where I actually lost one of my uncles revealed something about a dynamic in the family that I think was quite interesting. One of the younger siblings was sharing how whilst he had connected with his older sibling that had just passed away, that
Mm-hmm.
they were not necessarily, um, he didn't necessarily almost consider him as a brother, but more like a guardian or a
Mm,
father figure in that self. So I think there was, because of the different generations in this one family, I think one of the things that my grandfather probably utilized was the art of, leading through delegation. Perhaps, it's always difficult to keep in touch with
yeah.
motivating kids at different ages. And so he probably relied on some of the older siblings to connect with younger siblings, find out what they have or what they need. And this is one dynamic that I actually picked up. I must also say that it's something you were just speaking about right now. Would have been very helpful. I can imagine trying to manage 22 Generation Z or Generation Alpha kids would be more difficult. I think the whole authoritarian type of structure, parental structure that existed amongst particularly anyone before millennials, I think made a very big difference. So it most likely what he
Yes.
said went. There was no questioning. Why do we have to do this? Whenever he instructed that this
Yes.
would be done, people would follow instructions. And I know this from having gone to a school where seniority was a very big thing. Once you were a senior, you could literally see a paper on the ground and get anyone junior to actually make sure that they comply and make things happen. And that's probably something, a dynamic that potentially was useful in the family. But with big families, there's always conflict involved, and there's also been
Mm.
some conflict stories that have come up. And I think by the time come out of a setup like this, you are well set in as far as navigating conflict. Whether it's something as simple as you're sharing
Mm.
a plate of food. My dad always tells me that they didn't grow up having each one have their own plate. Everyone would be dished up in one big dish with maize meal and another big dish with relish. And if you were slow, sometimes, all the food would finish. So you learn to survive quickly enough. You learn to resolve conflicts.
Wow.
You learn to manage situations a lot better. So those are some of the dynamics that come top of mind that I think were quite, that emerged from that experience.
So actually, something that came to mind for me is one thing that came to mind for me is the dynamic of first the generational thing, because I'm part of Generation X, where they
Yeah.
kind of say we were the generation where we woke up in the morning, put some clothes on, and our parents kicked us out of the house until it was dark. We made up our own games. We figured things out the hard way. It wasn't
Yeah.
virtual. So you didn't learn how to ride a skateboard or swim virtually online.
Yeah.
You did it for real and almost drowned. You did it for real and cut your arms, cut your legs, learned the hard way. You didn't play football, virtually and like, I'm great manager, I'm the best goalie or whatever, because it was because
Yeah.
you learned through diving for the ball, getting kicked,
Yeah.
learning how to hustle and move. But when you actually spoke about the situation as far as the food, it was that I would imagine you had to have manners. So you weren't elbowing and punching and pushing anybody, but you had to learn how to assert yourself to get what you want,
Absolutely.
even at a meal on a daily basis. So these micro behaviors, I would imagine, would feed into the way that particular generation would have engaged with people outside of the home. So
Yes.
when it comes to like what you do in helping people with speaking and speeches and getting their message across, what are some of the things that you draw upon from your own experience, your own life, your own history, that you're able to use to help people identify that thing within themselves, their values, or the thing that they have that's powerful that they can get out? Um, how do you help them overcome those barriers of self-doubt, etc.?
Well, I think something that's, I mean, in public speaking, for example, the number one rule is get to know your audience. I was at an analyst briefing once. I used to work in investor relations, and we had a brand manager talk about brand equity, brand management to rural farmers who the only branding they probably understood was the marking of their cows to say, "Oh, this
Hmm.
is my cow."
Hmm.
And so, whilst he used technically correct language, it's not language that connected with the
Hmm.
audience. And so, a lot of times, I think it's George Bennett's show that had the quote that the problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. I could say something to you in French, and because of a language barrier, it doesn't reach you, or because of a knowledge barrier, it doesn't reach you. So it's very important whenever you are trying to connect with people, and actually also drawing from this circumstance to build that level of connection and trust. And connection is almost like calling, right? When I call you, it's important not to start talking before I answer the phone. And I think sometimes as speakers, people, we need to avoid the idea of downloading what we know in our head and almost assess the different levels at which the audience are. Maybe I'm doing a sales presentation. If I'm looking at the finance guy is worried about not losing too much money. So whenever there's a part of my product where it will reduce the amount of money spent on this, I need to be looking at that finance person because that's what they care about. The marketing person doesn't care about that. The
Hmm.
marketing person I look at whenever I talk about, oh, it will increase market share, it will increase customer retention. That's what they're interested in. So you need to figure out ways, who are the pleasure seekers in the audience, who are the pain avoiders, and speak a language that they actually understand, which reminds me of Nelson Mandela, who says, speak to a man in a language they understand, it gets to
Hmm.
their head. But speak to a man in their own language, then you get to their heart. And I think that is also the core of any leadership, because I come from because of the work I do. I differentiate management and leadership. And I know because we've generalized these terms, typically the leadership team is also known as the management team. But what I've come to just say to people is whether you call it management or leadership, they both have management responsibilities and leadership responsibilities. And the leadership responsibilities are solely focused on the human aspects. You lead people and you manage things. And so when it comes to leading people, I've got so many leaders I work with who have teams and they do not know what to do with those teams. Well, how do you lead them? It's actually getting to know these people. So, no, do they have kids? What is it that they care about? Maybe they want their kids to be successful. Maybe they have a child who plays tennis and they're trying to figure out how they can support their talent to grow. Why? Because when you know those things, that's how you are able to know how to motivate someone. You cannot motivate someone on something that's not important to them. It becomes difficult. But when you leverage what's important to them, when someone misbehaves at work, when you say, is this the example you want to set for your daughter? How is this going to serve your goal of actually helping your daughter achieve these results? That becomes challenging. Or as my father, there's a reason why I shared the tennis story. My dad shares one of his proudest leadership moments as a moment when he saw an advert on TV. Sorry, not on TV, in the newspaper. He was leading a workshop, and one of the diesel fitters or the train mechanics in his under his watch had a daughter that was playing tennis, but with a small salary, he never had bigger dreams than what he could see about the child. And so, having seen these scholarship opportunities, he called this guy and he says, "Oh, you've got a daughter that's pursuing tennis. Have you seen the scholarships?" And so he saw the scholarships, but he couldn't comprehend how, playing tennis in the UK applied to him and his daughter. And my dad took him through and helped him apply for it and gave him a reference. And lo and behold, in about 12 months later, well, I don't remember what the time period was, the mother of the wife to that gentleman and the daughter had to move to the UK permanently on a scholarship. And ever since that day, whenever I met this gentleman in town with my dad, he would always remind me, I could do anything for your father because he changed our lives. And that's how
Mm-hmm.
you get effective behavior from your teams and your thing. It's because when you show that you care about them, they will want to reciprocate, which is natural of humans. And that's how you get an engaged and motivated team. So that's some of the ways that those things then apply.
There's a lot in there. And I was even taking a few notes in there because management and leadership, lead people, manage things.
Yes.
And the getting to know, and this is part of my, ICM praxis
Okay.
approach, is how do we do that and what are the obstacles? So one of the things that came to my mind is I may be doing the work to engage with my audience. I know who they are, but some of the habits and behaviors now looking especially into where we are right now in society with virtual meetings, etc. These create the blockers to me being able to communicate effectively. For instance, their camera not being on, so I can't look at their face and see how they're responding. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Them not being engaged because their camera's on, but they're looking to the side and they're working on email while I'm trying to get a point across.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then also even like the cultural and generational thing. So there may be some people who are older, maybe because of their age of them having children a certain age. You mentioned, is this the kind of thing that would help your daughter achieve her objectives?
Mhm.
Again, that is also sensitivity on my part to know where to say that and when to say that. It would have to be
Yes.
one on
Yes.
one. And even
Yeah.
one on one with certain people in certain generations, it'd be like, you're using personal information against me to
Yeah.
manipulate me. So that then goes back to the importance of speaking from your heart, creating
Mhm.
trust, being a person of integrity, being a
Yeah.
person where they are clear about your intent and you're consistent in your behavior. So when I do bring it up, there will be that twinge of, ooh, he got me. But it wasn't said out of malice. It wasn't
Alice.
said in manipulation. It was said out of caring to motivate me to be the person I've told him or her I want to be. So there's
Yes.
so much relational stuff in leadership that it's the current environment, from my perspective, throws up a bunch of blockers. that we have to be able to lead teams, lead people to understand what those blockers and challenges are, to remove them, to allow the relationship. Because as a business change and transformation person, I go into teams where it's routine that people don't have their cameras on. It's routine where people aren't paying attention. It's
Mm,
routine for people to be late to a meeting. Yeah, it's routine not to have an agenda and allow it to go all over the place. Right? So to me, these are some of the cultural elements that we have to be aware of as professionals in change and transformation, to me, to address up front. Because failing
yeah.
to do that, all these other big things are not going to work.
Yes. In
What are your
fact,
thoughts on that?
to connect this to a model by Patrick Lencioni on the 5 dysfunctions of a team, he talks about the base being trust, and where that comes from, trust comes from openness and vulnerability. And so when you hear a lot of noise being made about safety, whether it's psychological safety or any kind of safety, which is sometimes the reason why people don't turn on cameras, because they're afraid that they will be judged or something will happen. When you create a safe environment, people are able to be more open, whether it's turning on their camera, whether it's saying exactly what they think in their mind, and vulnerable. And when there's openness and vulnerability, there's that trust, which is the base of any kind of relationship. When people trust each other, they're willing to risk for each other. And so people are willing to engage in healthy conflict, in healthy debates about situations. And outcomes don't necessarily need to go my way, but when I feel like I'm heard, or at least my point has been heard, suddenly I'm willing to commit to the
Mm-hmm.
outcome that's there. And when there's commitment, there isn't a shortage of people wanting to raise their hands to lead or be accountable for the actions of the team. And when there's accountability, you get those results. And so it's super important, as you said, to draw on those nuances that allow for that relationship where you're able to say certain things. And, one of the big things about leadership is diplomacy and tact are very important. And so there's also a lot of situational context that needs to go into how you
Mm-hmm.
pass on the same message. The same message, I mean, if you have more than one child, you probably know that in certain instances, if two of your children had, had a similar transgression, the way you address it with one may be different to the other, just simply because of a
Mm-hmm.
difference in temperament, different in their personality, and difference in whatever aspect of their life that they see it differently. And so I think that's why it's important to pay attention to these seemingly small things that will end
And
up having a big difference.
I actually refer to those things of grains of sand in
Okay.
machinery.
Love that.
Because if you have the tolerance of two gears that are coming together, that is X number of microns, a grain of sand will stop that machinery from working. But collectively, when you throw in cameras being off, people not paying attention, no agendas, low trust, low emotional intelligence and awareness of the leader to know
Yeah.
the situational awareness of how to deal with people, the leadership skills, the self-awareness, all these things. This is why people throw more oil money into the machinery and just force it through. That's how we're keeping our Fortune 100 company going. And it's grinding all these things up. And ultimately, it's eroding relationships. Because I'm glad you mentioned Patrick Lencioni, because he has another book called The Advantage. Actually,
Yeah.
my opening segment is a picture of me with Patrick Lencioni,
Oh,
right?
beautiful.
But it's this whole thing of organizational health. And this is why I think the praxis of joining these theories and knowledge we have with actually applying it, there are systems, there are tools, there's a science behind knowing how to apply these theories, knowing how to build trust. Looking at the book from Stephen Covey, The Speed of Trust. The
Yes.
higher the trust, the lower the cost, the faster things go. But
Mm.
that's a great theory, but how do you apply it? And I think that's where you and I, as leadership coaches, as change and transformation professionals, we have a role to, as artists, knowing all of the science, what tool is appropriate for this organization, this team, and this individual. And I think that's what's missing, and it's hard to quantify. So when you show up to the table, all your experience from you being, your grandfather having 22 kids, you being a great, a grandchild of somebody with so many other cousins, etc. You from your experience in Zimbabwe, the cultural aspects of that, you as a professional, you with your training, you with all the books, what you bring to the table is far more than, let's say, I'm a leadership coach.
Yes.
Because even this engagement, again, comes down to people being aligned on their understanding, not only of the term, what does leadership mean? Like you said, the distinction between management and leadership, to also the value of this training, because many of the leaders that I work with, it's a great ambition to have a leadership coach. And they may not have the funds or may not be willing to commit the funds because they don't see the value in it to do it themselves, or they're waiting for their organization to show them. But in the meanwhile, all these relationships are breaking down because of their lack of understanding of human dynamics, psychology, what processes to put in place to remove the sand from the machinery.
Yeah.
Anyway, with that said, it's just been really enlightening speaking with you, because of the fact that this is about the person, the man behind the job title, and
Yes.
what you as a change and transformation professional bring to the table. And I'm really looking forward to working with you more through the Oxford Review, because that's, to me, one of the key communities that I work with, where people understand the science and we're getting together as artists to share how we apply the tools, or even the network. So if we find an organization that needs somebody with that expertise, we know somebody who's engaged with firsthand over many months.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap up this episode, because I think what you've brought right now is powerful and probably enough for people to digest for right now. But as we touch on other things in the future, if you wouldn't mind joining me again on another podcast to share more of your insights and how to apply the science of what you do into the specific organizations.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for joining us, to your lovely audience.